clear cutting of level bottoms. We use long lines and we use purse seines. And you just think of the controversy about dolphin-safe tuna. So we now have purse seines that allow most of the dolphins to escape, but dolphins, many species of dolphins, are failing to reproduce because for some strange reason they don't like life-threatening experiences on a regular basis. And so they are not reproducing. And so a couple of the most abundant species of dolphins in the tropical eastern Pacific have had precipitous declines in reproduction. And all of this is done as if the climate is not changing, and that changes in climate will have no. Alaskan pollock is being managed in the Bering Sea today as if climate change were not a factor, in spite of the fact that the Bering Sea is getting warmer and the pollock are moving from our side of the strait to the Russian side of the strait and a whole lot of other things. So that's most of what I want to say. I just want to finish that many of you maybe saw an op-ed in the New York Times a few weeks ago by Ray Hilburn, who's one of the great quantitative fisheries biologists in the world, and the title of that op-ed was "Let Them Eat Fish." And that op-ed was based on an article that was published by Boris Worm and Ray and almost 20 other scientists in Science a couple of years ago, in which they analyzed 10 stocks of fish from developed countries. And of those 10 stocks, and the big idea was that these were hopeful fisheries that indicated that we were getting our act together. But in only one of those stocks was the spawning stock actually increasing. And 7 of the 10 stocks that were the great hope for the future were below sustainable biomass, below BMSY. So we have a very, very long way to go. And that's for the fisheries that are just the very small fraction of fisheries that are managed in the United States. And says nothing about the other fisheries in the world. And with that optimistic picture, I will leave it to everybody else.
All right. I'm just going to stand here because I'm going to.
George, you want your mic?
No, I tend to speak up, so I will, if that's okay. Does that work for people? How do you make this? How do you play a slideshow on a Mac?
Go up to that corner.
Like, where's the star D on the play?
I think that one.
PC should be banned.
PC should be banned? How does that work? It's kind of small.
I'm with you.
Okay, so my name's George Leonard. I run the aquaculture program at Ocean Conservancy, and we really are focused on what are we going to do about producing seafood in our country, trying not necessarily to be put our heads in the sand about what's happening internationally, but that's sort of the frame in which I'm going to try to put out a couple principles that I think we need, principles and questions that we as a society need to address. And in doing so, I think we want to make sure that we don't forget what Jeremy is saying. I was a grad student at Brown University when Jeremy was doing a lot of really groundbreaking work on his historical ecology. And he would show up when we grad students would feel really good about our little small-scale experiments, and we'd include predators and we'd leave out, competitors, and he would show up and talk about 1,000 years of history and sort of put us all in our place, right? So this long view of where the oceans are is really, really important that we don't forget about. But what I've spent the last decade or so sort of dealing with is the here and the now, and what are we going to do if we actually want to eat fish, right? Rather than sort of take ourselves out of that consumption picture. And I think the future of the fish is really about this intersection of wild and farmed fish. These two issues are often talked separately, and I think if we want to have a future for fish that we can eat and fish that are actually healthy in the ocean, we've basically got to figure out what that vision is and how we want to get there. History is aquaculture is here. It's 50% of what we now eat. The reason that wild catch figure doesn't collapse, as Jeremy would suggest it should, based on sort of what he suggested, is because for every fish that we overfish, we go find a new one to fill its place. And so while it looks like there's a lot of fish out there, that's essentially because we've expanded the footprint of our global fisheries. And when things have gone down the toilet, we found another fish to catch. But basically half of what we eat is now farmed. I try to be a glasses half full kind of guy on this issue because, partly because I think we have to be optimistic if we want to get to a place that we want to get to. But the other is that if you compare where we are as sort of a society and a community from, say, 20 years ago, when no one was talking about this issue, people are engaged, right? We've got the science community that's providing a lot of input and perspective on this. We've got the seafood industry who's really sort of taking charge in many ways. We've got the conservation community who's sort of rallied around global fisheries in the last 15 years. And individual activists and consumers are playing a huge role here. Now, is it going to work? I don't know. And I would suggest that we'll know in 10 or 15 years whether we turn things around and that we ought to follow the data. But I'd like to be positive that we can get there. The alternative is really to sort of sleepwalk into the future. And this is a term that Paul Greenberg used when I was speaking to him. He wrote his new book, For Fish. Has anybody read For Fish? Not to not plug your book, which is also a great book that you ought to buy. But For Fish is a great book because what Paul is really talking about is sort of proactively trying to shape the future that we want about our seafood supply. So the question I think we need to ask in the context of our own domestic seafood supply is, are we okay with what Jeremy said? Are we okay that 80% of the seafood that we eat here is neither grown nor farmed here? And if you just look at other food commodities, there's that 80%-ish figure. These data are old. But compared to everything else, most of the seafood we eat comes from somewhere else. That's not true for red meats and dairy products and vegetables. Okay? So if you think about going to Safeway, there's a real disparity there. You know, maybe we're okay with the fact this is not a great figure. I couldn't find a good figure that essentially shows that 80% figure continues to go up year after year, ever so inexorably. So if we're okay with that, then I think we proceed in a way in which we are essentially sort of outsourcing to others for our seafood supply. Now what comes with that is, one, sort of accepting the environmental performance of fisheries or aquaculture in other countries. And what comes with that is the sense that we're not worried that at some point, and this is particularly the case in China, that they at some point might want to decide that they don't want to grow all this fish for us, but they might want to feed their own people with it as their population grows. And at some point, sort of like oil, the spigot might get turned off at some point in the future. So we need to think about what we want to do with that in the future. And this is the beautiful thing about taking a PowerPoint and a PC and then rolling it over to a Mac. See how that rolled to the back? So I'd like to just propose there are essentially 4 kind of questions or principles that we in the U.S. need to sort of embrace if we want to have a bigger role over our seafood supply. The first is that, and this is true at the global level, we need to essentially break the connection between farmed fish and wild fish. And what this is supposed to show is a bunch of small forage fish, things like sardines and mackerel and anchovies, at the base of ecological food webs that are essentially going in 2 directions. To the right, they go up through fish meal and fish oil, and they get converted into things like farmed salmon. And to the left, they go up through things like tuna and other fish that we catch and we eat directly. Okay? So there is a fundamental problem here where you've got aquaculture pulling on the forage fish at the same time that fisheries are pulling on forage fish through wild fisheries. And if we want aquaculture to ultimately add to the overall seafood supply, we need to figure out a way to break that connection. The second issue is, this is supposed to say stop genetically engineered fish. How many people know about genetically engineered salmon? Ooh, very knowledgeable, right? Okay, so the FDA is currently determining whether it's going to allow the first genetically engineered animal into our food supply. And this is not going to be a pig or a cow. It turns out it's going to be a farmed salmon. There's been a lot of brouhaha around this. It is likely if it happens to not be labeled like the rest of genetically engineered food is. We think this is a huge turning point, not only for the future of our seafood supply, but in particular the future of fish farming. And the question I would ask society, not the individual company and not the FDA, is do we want genetically engineered fish to be essentially the way we supplement our wild fish? Because once it takes hold and once it's economically viable, obviously there'll be a business advantage there. I think that's a question that we as sort of a society need to grapple with. The other, this is supposed to say promote food diversity. If you think about what's happened, and Barton, you obviously know a lot more about this than I'm not a chef. I can basically cook those fish sticks, and I've been known to make a hot dog or two every once in a while. I am not a chef. But one of the things you notice when you go into the grocery store from a land-based protein perspective, there's basically three choices. There's chicken and there's beef and there's pork, right? Motor oil is motor oil. In the context of seafood, one of the great things about seafood has been historically a huge diversity of things to eat from the sea. Everything from seaweeds to mussels and clams to sardines and anchovies to flounder to tuna, right? It's just a remarkable sort of palette on which to cook, and Barton obviously talks eloquently about that. In the case of aquaculture, aquaculture is going the direction of food production on land. That is, think about what we eat now a lot of. We eat a lot of farm salmon and a lot of farm shrimp. When I was a kid, we ate salmon at weddings and funerals. We went shrimp, actually it's the other way around. We had salmon once a summer when the wild salmon ran, and we ate shrimp at weddings and funerals, and that was about it. You can eat shrimp every meal of the day if you want now. I think aquaculture, if we proactively shape it, can actually help grow a diversity of food for us to eat. But if we don't, it's likely to really focus on just a few essentially commodity products. The fourth principle is, what do we want to pay for sustainability? I believe at the end of the day, if something, you get what you pay for. Cheap imported tilapia from China is cheap for a reason. If we produce more seafood here in this country, it's going to be more expensive. We have stronger rules and regulations. The question is, are we as a society willing to pay for that? Or do we want super cheap chicken McNuggets and super cheap, tilapia fillets, and then we sort of need to accept the consequences of that. Our work is largely focused on the open ocean, and what are we going to do about open ocean aquaculture? This is what it might look like. This is a farm that's in the water in Hawaii. This is an ongoing debate in this country about what are we going to do about marine aquaculture. And I would suggest that again, we need to decide collectively what we want to do about this. There are a host of environmental concerns. These are real. These are in the science literature. Things like escaped fish and disease transfer, nutrient pollution, impacts on food webs through the feed issue. These are all legitimate concerns, and that our policy position on this has basically been, unless this country, in this quest to sort of better control its seafood, can put together a comprehensive management framework that addresses all those issues, then we shouldn't be doing it at all. Now the alternative to that, and maybe it's not an alternative, but it's a different approach that we could take, is more land-based farming. These are just a number of pictures of different land-based facilities. This kind of, if we pursue this route, you resolve a lot of those proximate environmental impacts, but there is no free lunch. There are land issues here, there are water issues here. I missed the water talk because I was really curious to see where that might intersect the question of how do we farm our seafood. And in addition, there are also usually greenhouse gas emissions consequences here because you have to pump a lot of water. So how do we want to pursue this? I think at the end of the day, particularly with respect to the ocean, the fundamental question is, what do we want our oceans to look like? Where do we want to go? And Sandra showed this picture earlier because I gave it to her. But this is a picture of Sangu Bay in China, and this bay is an entire bay that's been allocated to aquaculture. Now, obviously, none of us in this room want our bays and estuaries to look like this, but other countries have made this decision. So we need to sort of think about what is our vision of our future oceans look like, what's the vision of aquaculture within that, and then I think this is also one of the major problems we have here in this issue that will keep us at the status quo unless we figure out, which is a societal question about what we're going to do, which is fishermen on one side and fish farmers on the other. generally fish farmers and fishermen don't like each other for a whole host of reasons. And if we want a future for seafood that actually works for societies, works environmentally, and works on the supply side, we've got to figure out a way that fishermen and aquaculture folks can work together to shape that future so that it works for both sectors. In a nutshell, I think if we can figure that out, I have lots more questions than I have answers. We can have our fish and eat them too. So,
Thanks, sir.
was that short enough? Good?
Okay. Can you flip those slides?
Probably not. I use a PC.
I'm Ed Rhodes. I work with Phillips Foods, and who's headquartered in Baltimore. But we have we source fish all around the world. We have now currently 19 processing plants, most of them in Asia, but some of them in Latin America as well.
Yep.
And I operate, for Phillips, I do their sustainable seafood sourcing, sustainable quotes, seafood sourcing, and also wear an aquaculture development hat. But I'm going to shed the aquaculture thing today and talk a little bit more on the wild fishery side.
Okay.
And George said his cup was half full. I guess mine's 60% full.
Excellent.
In terms of my optimism about what we're doing. However, I think with Jeremy's comments and with George's and probably the way the panel's going to go, we'll see there's a lot of room for some interaction here as well. So I'm taking an industry perspective, if I could make this move forward. I mean, I think, to start off with, our responsibility is to try to meet the global demand for seafood. Now, whether we can do that, some of Jeremy's comments obviously a little bit more pessimistic about that. Our seafood comes from either aquaculture or from fisheries. And what I really want to say is if we get sustainable fisheries right, we'll get as much seafood out of our ocean fisheries as we can. And when I say sustainable fisheries and doing it right, those are words that are pretty electric. Obviously, everyone has their own definition of what those are and how we're going to get there. Purchasing decisions really make a difference. If as consumers we buy, again, quotes, certified, could be Marine Stewardship Council certified or someone else's, or use Monterey Bay Aquarium's best choice rating system or whatever. Basically, we end up, more or less as Jeremy said, we end up supporting the organized and fishery and well-to-do fisheries in affluent nations, because those are the ones that can do fisheries management. Those are the ones that use taxpayer money and do stock assessments, for example. The 85% of the fisheries in the world that we source from, that the United States sources from, don't have that luxury. These developing countries don't have those kinds of resources. But if you want to go that way, if you want to eat sustainable seafood, MSC, Monterey Bay green, you're going to probably feel pretty good about it. And if you're in business, you can use that perhaps as a marketing advantage in what you're selling as well. But as everyone has said, only 7% of the world's fisheries are MSC certified currently, and perhaps, and this is kind of a wild guess, another 10% may be listed as green, if you would, on someone's rating charts. But the U.S., 83 or 84% comes from imported sources. This is the $14 billion in species. We can get to that perhaps later. But if the goal is to try to increase the number of sustainable fisheries in the world, how do we get there? And purchasing choices, as I said, they really can make a difference. If we buy only sustainable seafood, sustainable again kind of in quotes, puts pressure on the non-compliant fisheries to get better. So it's basically a kind of a stick approach to it. If we buy sustainable seafood, but also support fisheries in transition to sustainability, that is fisheries that are doing a good job of getting to sustainability, I look at that as an improvement over just buying the certified stuff. And then if you want to take it a step further, you should actually invest in those fisheries, especially in the developing part of the world that need that help and that assistance. because the governments and the industries themselves don't have the resources to do that. And looking at, in reverse, what happens if we don't support those fisheries in transition or those fisheries in developing countries? Well, their market share, their market value will decline. That gives them a lot less money, if you would, to do the right thing in terms of working on their sustainability effort and the deficiencies in those fisheries. And those fisheries will eventually, many of them will fail, and even if they don't fail economically, they're going to fail in the sense of productivity. And so we lose resources again for the world. So very simply, what we at Phillips do, and what I'm suggesting, is that we do responsible seafood sourcing, and that is to source from sustainable or certified fisheries, but also to source from fisheries that are in transition to sustainability. And how do we do that? And trying to identify fisheries in transition is a pretty tough road to hoe at this point. You can try to get information from your seafood supplier as to what the status of the source fishery is, or you can, by doing that, basically push down the food chain, push down the chain to the point where you can get the kind of information to see if there are fisheries improvement programs underway for those fisheries. And where you find actions that look like those fisheries are heading in the direction of sustainability, that's what I would call a positive fishery in transition, and that should be a legitimate source for you. And then, lastly, you might consider even investing in those fisheries. And an example that I like to use, Santa Monica Seafood has invested in a number of fisheries, for example, with fisheries improvement programs to try to improve those fisheries that they source from. And there is some additional help out there to identify fisheries in transition. The Sustainable Fisheries Partnership has a pretty good web resource called Fish Source, which is shown there. And Fish Source actually lists many of the fisheries in the world that have fisheries improvement projects underway to move them towards sustainability. And I hear a groundswell, at least, at Monterey Bay Aquarium may start at least a business-to-business system so that a business can work through that system to find out if a particular fishery in the world has a fisheries improvement program in place, which makes it a more legitimate source. And an example of this from the aquaculture world, of course, is the Pangasius in Vietnam. World Wildlife Fund had, wearing two heads, I guess, at that point. They had a group that advised the Europeans not to eat Pangasius because it wasn't a sustainable aquaculture project or product. And yet World Wildlife Fund had people doing aquaculture dialogues in Vietnam trying to improve the aquaculture there. And eventually they came up with a term, something like in transition to certification, not in transition to sustainability, but in transition to MSC or Aquaculture Stewardship Council certification. And some examples. There are quite a few fisheries in the world. If you go to the SFP website, for example, you'll find quite a few fisheries in transition to sustainability. And I just need to really finish with a small example. Phillips, the company I work for, is the largest crab purveyor of crab in the world. We're responsible for almost 50% of the imports into the United States. 80% of the crab in the world comes from Asia. 80% of the crab that we eat in the United States comes from Asia. It supports about 250,000 fishermen. That fishery does. And as Jeremy said, and I will repeat, in almost all of the countries where we source crab from, there are no regulations. And if there are regulations, they're not enforced. And there are real signs that the fishery is stressed. The crab size is getting smaller. Fishermen are working harder to catch them. So what can we do? Well, here's what we did. Starting 4 years ago, we organized the fishermen and the processors in the countries that we source from. So we basically formed crab producer associations in a number of countries. We got the Sustainable Fisheries Partnership, an NGO, to work with them on developing a fisheries improvement plan, and then it needed funding. So what we did at that point, just 2 years ago, we organized all of the importers of crab in the United States, the 12 major companies, and Phillips is one of them. And we have a self-imposed tax or assessment on all of the imports coming into the country. It's only about $0.015 a pound at this point, but it gives us $500,000 a year to invest back into the sustainable fisheries efforts in the countries from which we source. And in recognition of that, the World Bank's thrown a couple $100,000 at us in the last couple of years as well, in recognition of that. And it's working slowly. There's a lot of education going on with the fishermen. The stock assessment programs are beginning to evolve. In one country, at least the Philippines, they have draft regulations for the crab fishery, which is a fairly robust plan. It has all the elements that a good fisheries management plan would have. Stock assessments, it has protected areas, nursery areas, closed seasons, minimum size, and so on. One of the things that we were able to do as the Crab Council this year, this group of U.S. companies, we actually decided through our own purchasing policy to set a minimum purchase size for crab in all of Asia. And we agreed with that policy in March of this year, and it'll go into effect in July. And interesting to me, and I think pretty exciting, the government of Indonesia immediately adopted that same strategy. They basically took the industry lead, and now we're going to institute that same minimum size in Indonesia through their LGU, through their local government units. And just basically finishing up, progress is being made. There's a long way to go, but we can only continue to support that work if our customers continue to buy what we sell. And so we're not sustainable yet. We're committed to sustainability, but we need your help. And I just would throw this out at the end, a strategy perhaps for the U.S. industry, especially for that 84% of the stuff that we import. You know, we have a pretty good list. We know what those fisheries are. Basically, we need to identify, I think, the industry partners that do that importation and make them responsible for those fisheries. So again, just as we did in Asia with the crab, organize the producers around the sustainability issue, organize the importers, evaluate the fishery, whether it's an MSC pre-assessment or some other tool, develop a fisheries improvement plan, and then provide the funding. That funding could come from all kinds of sources, but at least with the crab example, it could come from the industry itself, and probably the U.S. industry that does the importing. And then at the very end, after a number of years, we may or may not seek some kind of certification, if you would, for those fisheries. So I'm going to quit there. That's as long as I need to go.
Okay.